This next series of videos is going to be looking at the classical civilizations in India, and then we're going to immediately proceed into a series of videos on classical civilizations in China. And so I wanted to clarify why we're talking about these two civilizations at the same time. One of them maybe goes without saying, but geographically they're fairly proximate to one another. They're both considered Asian empires, but other things that we should certainly be clear about. One of them is that they're strongly connected by trade. Now, we tend to associate the Silk Road mainly with China, but the Silk Road also had stops in India. And so both of these empires are strongly connected to each other, and they're also connected to the West via the Silk Road. And we're also going to see that there are going to be new belief systems, both in a religious sense, and some of them are slightly more secular when we're talking about China. And in the case of Buddhism, this is a new religion that originates in India, but it actually becomes even more prominent in Southeast Asia, which we'll talk about. And other belief systems that we're going to look at, you see them all listed here, but Hinduism and Buddhism, they have their roots in India, so we'll talk about them in these slides. And then we see Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism originate in China around this period. And then we're also going to see that the social and political structures are going to evolve in the classical era in both India and China. The most significant evolution in the social structure in India would be the caste system, which definitely has long roots into future periods. The caste system is still in some ways apparent in India today, even if it's not technically part of the legal code. And then in China, we have the evolution of the civil service system in the classical era, and this still has significance today. And it definitely shapes many of the future Chinese dynasties. So let's talk specifically about India now. Again, one of the really important social changes that we see in India is that we're going to have the evolution of the caste system, something that most people are familiar with. And so as you can see with the graphic below, the caste system is a strict social hierarchy. We've seen this in other societies. This is obviously not unique to India. And what's interesting is that this originates actually with the Aryan peoples who, if you remember from period 1, were people that came from farther north and ended up settling in the Indian subcontinent. As far as their racial makeup was concerned, they tended to be a little bit more light in complexion. And so some of the reasons why they decided to come up with this hierarchy was to distinguish between the people of Aryan origin and the people of what we call Dravidian origin. Dravidian were the more traditionally dark-skinned people of India. And if you still go to India, it's not as apparent today, but the farther south you go in India, you do see that there is a difference in complexion. And some of this we can link back to the Aryan migration. But what we do see, obviously, is that because hundreds of years have passed, there's been a lot more intermarriage between people of different races. And so the caste system eventually doesn't really have as much to do with skin color, but it has more to do with just social class. Just briefly going over, this graphic sort of speaks for itself, but just going into a little bit more detail, the top class, as you can see here, when the caste system was originally designed, we see that the top 3 classes were meant to be people of Aryan origin, and the lower class, along with the Untouchables that we're going to talk about in the next slide, were people who were of Dravidian origins. So the Brahmins make up the top class. They were the priests. So they're also the most educated of all the classes. Their jobs tended to be spiritual leaders, and they also served as educators. The Kshatriyas were the warrior class. They're still very, very important and wealthy. They served occasionally as rulers. We're going to talk about one of the most significant Kshatriyas who changes his ways. The original Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, came from this class. In addition to serving as rulers, they also were obviously part of the military. They served as the elite in the military. They were nobles, and they also owned property. Then the Vaishyas, they were the merchant or artisan class. We see that they oftentimes served as traders. They were also agriculturalists. This is not to be confused with the class below it. We do have obviously farmers and peasants in the lower class. When we say agriculturalists, we tend to be talking more about people who owned large plots of land. So you can see here we have farmers and farm workers. The people who were farmers actually owned the land that they worked, whereas farm workers were just employed to work on somebody else's land. We also have merchants. We have people who own, or people who lent money, and also smiths. They all made up this class here. And the Shudras, they were the peasant or serf class. Again, they were unskilled servants for the upper 3 classes, and they were serfs. So they tended not to own property. And as you can see again, as the original caste system was defined, this was meant to be the caste that made up the people who were not of Aryan origin. Now, one group that we don't see specifically in this pyramid, but that we would be remiss not to mention, would be the untouchable class. They actually many times do not show up in the social hierarchy at all because they're seen as completely different. They're seen as a group that could never move upward into another echelon of the social hierarchy. Their name in Hindi is Dalit. And they were seen as untouchable partly because of the jobs that they performed. They performed some of the most unpleasant jobs in society. So they would do things like dispose of dead bodies and clean sewer systems. We see an image of a modern Dalit here doing just that. They were called untouchables because their work was considered so dirty that coming in contact with them would supposedly pollute members of the other classes. So again, as you can see in this graphic in the previous slide, they are not even included in the social hierarchy because they are seen as, like the word defines them as, untouchable. The caste system did experience some evolution over time. Part of this is because as the population increased, there was an increased complexity in terms of the social organization. There are more jobs that emerge, and we're also going to see new groups migrate to India. So as time goes on, the caste system becomes more complex. You don't need to know all of these subcastes, but you just need to know that they exist. So the caste system started to evolve into having subcastes. These were called jatis. And again, they represent the growing complexity of society. Now, as we evolve closer into the present day, the caste system eventually became forbidden. But we do see that its legacy lives on even in modern India. If we think about the British colonial period, which ends in 1947, we'll obviously talk about this later on in the year. Just as a brief summary, it was when the British Empire actually ruled India as a colony. They liked using the caste system and they applied it to their own British class system. Part of it was because they wanted to distinguish British people from Indian people, and they wanted to make it clear that the British people were a higher caste than they were. They saw it as a way to sort of keep the Indian people in line. This is obviously going to start to fade away as the Indian people move towards their own independence. What we do see is that even now, it is still possible to distinguish at least between people's ancestral caste based on their last name. And what we also see is that in rural areas, it is a little bit more pronounced, the legacy of the caste system. The Dalits still perform some of the least hygienic jobs in the rural areas. And then among the highest classes, what we do see still is that even if the caste system is not legal, people's social class is still very significant for determining marriage choices. So let's talk about the evolution of religions in India during the classical era, and then we'll take a break and start off with another video after that. This is a very small religion, but still you should be familiar with it. There could be a question maybe comparing different religions in classical India, so know about Jainism, even if it doesn't have a long legacy. So Jainism starts around the 5th century BCE, which is around the same time that Buddhism is also emerging. So Hinduism already existed. Jainism is going to be almost, you could see it as sort of like a stricter form of Hinduism, just to simplify it. And part of the reason why I say that is because their ideas come from the same text, the Upanishads, which you may remember we talked about in period 1. But the Jainists have a much more strict way of life. They believe, according to the Upanishads, that all creatures of earth were part of a larger soul. And so because they believed that, they thought that all creatures possessed a godly soul. And so they thought that individuals should show mercy to animals. And so Jainists are very strict about this. They are very strict vegetarians. And you can see from the picture below, they actually wear masks over their mouths. And the reason why that is because they want to avoid swallowing insects. And also you see that very few Jainists perform farming, and one of the reasons why that is because they don't want to kill pests in the process. Now, Jainism is not going to be hugely popular, and part of this is because it does require such a demanding lifestyle. Some of its doctrines, though, have been incorporated into other religions. So one of the things that they were very, very adamant about was this principle of ahimsa, which means nonviolence. This is something that's very significant to Buddhists as well. And we do see that there are still some Jainis today, but they make up a very small percentage of India's religious population. Many Hindus, though, do identify with some of the Jainist ethics with their own beliefs. So vegetarianism is also something that is practiced by many Hindus, but they're just not as strict about it, not with the mask wearing, not with the insect eating and things like that. Buddhism, again, also was a new religion that evolved during the classical era. It was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, and he was a member of the warrior class. If you remember from the previous slide, the warrior class, they were the Kshatriyas, right? So they're the second rung in the social pyramid. He was a very wealthy man, and he was very pampered and sheltered in the early years of his life. But around 530 BCE, he left his home for one of the first times, and he experienced suffering for the first time. He himself did not suffer originally. Instead, he saw people that were going hungry, people that were starving, and he started to ask the question, why is there suffering in the world? Sort of, why am I living this sheltered existence when other people don't even have enough to eat? And so what he decides to do is fairly dramatic. He decides to abandon his life of shelter and comfort, and he becomes what we call an ascetic. What this means is it's someone who rejects worldly pleasures and lives a life denying themselves of these kind of pleasures. We can think this is sort of like what monks and nuns do, right? This is something that they abandon all their wealth, they live lives of poverty, right? This is basically what an ascetic is. So he starts to meditate very frequently. This is an image of him meditating under a Bodhi tree. And he, according to legend, came to several realizations, and he calls these realizations enlightenment. And so the word Buddha actually means enlightened one. So we can see Siddhartha Gautama as the original Buddha. And so just some general ideas that go with Buddhist doctrine. The Four Noble Truths are a good way to just generalize what Buddhism is all about. And so these sort of speak for themselves, but the Four Noble Truths, the first one is life involves great suffering. And so obviously this is something that he witnessed when he first left his home. The second of the Noble Truths is that all suffering stems from desires for worldly pleasures and material things. And so we can imagine that this is one of the reasons why Siddhartha Gautama decides he wants to abandon his life of material possessions and wealth. He does believe, according to the third of the Four Noble Truths, that suffering can end, and it will do so when one eliminates worldly desires. So again, the idea is if you get rid of all those possessions, then you can end your suffering. And also the way that you can achieve enlightenment, or the way that you can end this suffering, is to follow the Eightfold Path. And so what is that, you may ask? So the Eightfold Path is basically the way of life for Buddhists. We don't have to memorize all of these by any means, but the idea is that according to the Eightfold Path, individuals, followers of Buddhism, are meant to meditate, reflect, and refrain from the pursuit of worldly pleasures. So again, it's sort of what Gautama did, right? The idea that he left his house and abandoned all of his wealth, meditated, that is sort of what people who follow the Eightfold Path are supposed to do. The goal is for people to detach oneself from worldly affairs over time, and this detachment rather, is meant to lead to enlightenment. And then after enlightenment, the ultimate goal of Buddhists is to achieve what is called nirvana. Now, nirvana is a peaceful state in the afterlife. Now, Buddhists believe in reincarnation, right? The idea that you come back after your life as you were reborn, right? Now, the goal of Buddhists is actually to end this cycle of reincarnation. Nirvana is seen as eternal peace. So reaching nirvana, again, means that you end that cycle of birth and rebirth and all the pain that goes with it. So some people think, oh, reincarnation is pretty awesome, right? You know, when you die, you end up being reborn again. Buddhists don't actually believe that. They think that when reincarnation ends, then they have truly achieved that state of nirvana. So let's just look at all the religions together. Again, we talked about Hinduism in period 1 a little bit, so that's why I'm not going over it in detail. We will talk about some Hindu duties that start to evolve in classical India in the next slide. So it'll be a little bit of Hinduism review. But just comparing the religions, we see this little Venn diagram as a helpful visual for that. But one of the things that we see that they all have in common is that all three of them, Hindus, Jainis, and Buddhists, all believe in an inward reflection and a hope to end the cycle of reincarnation. So that's sort of what karma is about, way of life, right? The idea that practicing a good and noble life is ultimately going to result in good things for you. But one of the major differences, though, is that Hindus are the only group of these three that actually still attach the caste system to their belief system. So this is something that really distinguishes the two, and this is something that still shows that the Hindus believe in that social hierarchy. Buddhists and Jainists reject the caste system. They thought that it was inconsistent with the ideals of showing mercy to all people and detaching oneself from worldly matters. That makes sense, right? How can you distinguish yourself based on wealth if one of the goals of your religion is to abandon those things, right? So again, one of the ways that you can remember the difference is to think that Hindus are still attached to that wealth, whereas Buddhists and Jainists are not. Buddhism was actually seen, therefore, as more accessible than Hinduism and Jainism. One of the reasons, obviously, why that was because it did not emphasize caste. So Buddhism was very attractive to the lower classes. We do see that some Jainists are also attracted to the lower, we do see that some of the lower classes are also attached to Jainism, but again, Buddhism was a lot of times seen as a better option just because it was less of a strict practice. Buddhist teachings were also passed forth orally and in local dialects, which was important because the lower classes were less likely to be educated and therefore less likely to be able to read. And so in Hindu practices, all of the doctrines were actually written down in the language of Sanskrit. That was the language that educated elites knew. And so another reason why Buddhism was attractive to the lower classes was they didn't have to know how to read these languages. You could sort of compare this. Eventually, we'll talk about the significance of the Protestant Reformation and how many Protestant Bibles were translated into the local languages instead of Latin. It's the same kind of thing here. So again, think of a connection. You can compare those. We also see that by the 5th century BCE, Buddhists are beginning to establish monasteries. And so again, this is really a way that they can abandon all those notions of wealth, worldly possessions. And this is, again, something that we could sort of compare to another religion in the future. About 500 years later, we're going to see that Christians are going to do the exact same thing, right? And establishing monasteries is, again, a way to devote your entire life to your faith, abandon all the wealth and inequality that is associated with life in society. So, again, as promised, I just wanted to talk briefly about one's duty in Hinduism, and then I want to talk about how religion also shapes gender roles, and then we'll take a break and go on to another video. So Hinduism also, even if Hinduism is something that is maybe less attractive to the lower classes, it still spreads very quickly throughout India in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. These teachings do spread orally through epic poems. Two of these epic poems, one of them was the Mahabharata and the other one was the Ramayana. These are something that make these two texts very, very accessible to everyone. If they were passed on by oral tradition, that meant that you could learn them even if you didn't know how to read. But one of the reasons, again, why Hinduism is maybe not as attractive to some of the lower classes was, again, that you, according to Hindu duty, were meant to adhere to your caste duties. What we also are going to see is that the poems of Hindu teachings are telling stories, telling epic tales, right? You could compare them to Greek and Roman literature to a certain extent, because some of the themes of these Hindu poems are telling stories about heroes and romance and adventure. And I just wanted to give a quote from the Mahabharata, which is, "Your business is with action alone, not by any means with the fruit of the action. Having recourse to devotion, perform actions, casting off all attachment, and being equable in success or ill success." And so the idea behind this quote is that your job is to fulfill your caste duties without really worrying about what the result is going to be or the fruits of the actions on earth. The idea is that after your death, you will ultimately know what the result of fulfilling your caste duties was. The message also is stressing that you shouldn't worry about doing things like meditating or practicing aestheticism because your goal is ultimately to behave the way that you're supposed to behave according to society. This is called practicing your dharma, right? Your dharma is sort of a code of conduct, your behavior, your duty. And so dharma is heavily stressed in the Hindu practices. And how does religion shape gender? In the classical Indian period, we also see that these epic poems that describe that describe some of the duties of religion are also articulating gender roles. Women, like many of the other classical societies, were not equal to men. There was an emphasis on wives being loyal and obedient to their husbands. The idea was that they were always meant to be subordinate. And what we also see is that there is some persistent inequality in gender roles in India's society, in India's future, even into the modern era. Although this is not always true, of course, we have certain instances where women did come of power, like you have a female prime minister, Indira Gandhi, in the 20th century. But for the most part, this is the exception. Women were still not typically seen as equal to men. Other examples of this, women could not become monks in the classical era. They also typically did not receive any sort of education. And what we also see is that these texts that shape your gender role, that shape your role within your caste, the Ramayana and Mahabharata, are still things that are widely read among Hindus today. Just like the Torah is still widely read among Jews, the Bible is still widely read among Christians. So the importance also with religion in the classical era is that these texts are still significant to the way in which people shape their religious beliefs today. So let's take a break, and then we're going to start to talk about the politics of classical India. So stay tuned, and thanks.